This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
This is the Books Podcast, and we're welcoming today Toby Litt. Toby, welcome to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The book we're going to talk about is Lifelike, and I think that must mean that it's your 12th book. I only just noticed that you're giving each of your books an alphabetical initial letter, so that we started off with Adventures in Capitalism, and then there was Beatniks and Corpsing and Dead Kid Songs and so on, all the way through to Lifelike. So this is the 12th book.
It is number 12. Some people got that on C and were very smug that they'd realised, but it's been going on for some time that the main books that I do are alphabetical, and it's a way for me to organise my head and my future.
There's more to it to that. We're going to come back to this aspect of Toby Litt, because there's an interesting sense going on with you of formalism and game playing and structure, which I want to talk about eventually. But first I want to talk about Lifelike, so that anything we do say in context it makes sense for this book. And it gets us straight into that question, because the kind of book it is, it's either a kind of a novel or a kind of a set of stories. And I'm still not sure. In fact, I'm going to ask you, which is it, Toby?
I wish I had a word. You know, a lot of people have written intimately collected books of short stories. Either they're linear or they're thematic or whatever, but there is a form there that we're developing collectively, and it's not shovel as in between short story and novel, and it's something that addresses the fact that the world is a very diverse place, and that different bits of it don't necessarily fit with one another in a way that a conventional novel could bring them in. They go off and they exist in different ways, and I think that's what it answers to, is not having to write a 19th century novel where basically everyone is covered with the same glaze.
I had got that by the end, that this is a book of connections flying apart, a sort of a globalistic thing,
yeah,
as opposed to that kind of Benorzic novel, which is carefully structured and comes round to a point that is sort of dictated by the beginning. There is an element of that in this.
Yeah.
We start off with Agatha and Paddy, whose little boy Max breaks his arm, and we end up with Agatha and Paddy and engaged with their little boy. So there's that sort of satisfaction of a coming round to where we started. But it's not a Schnitzlerian thing. It's not La Ronde. We're not going round in a formal circle.
No, the form, which I've tried really hard to find a simple way of explaining, is like a tennis tournament in reverse. In other words, the final was the book Ghost Story, where Paddy and Agatha appeared. And then we're travelling backwards in time, so we're going to the sort of next stories of the semi-final. So it's someone versus Paddy and Agatha versus someone else. And then we go further
you've made
back.
Each chapter is somebody and somebody.
Yes.
Paddy and Agatha, or Max and Dylan is one of them.
Yes.
Yeah. So that each of the stories or chapters or passages.
I ended up calling them episodes in
Episodes.
desperation.
I like episode.
Yes.
Actually, I think that works. I like episode. So that each one of them has two, or sometimes it's John and John in one of them.
Yes.
And it's Henry and anybody who'll listen.
Yes.
In one of the chapters.
Yeah.
It's very funny, this book. And one of the things I liked is that you're totally deadpan. You as the writer, you never acknowledge that this is funny.
Well, it may be that as the writer, I never know. I think I could probably count on one hand the number of times, not ever, in the last 10 years, that I've sat at my desk and laughed at something that I wrote and thought, that's funny. Usually because it's something that's so ridiculous I can't include it anyway. But most of the time I am deadpan to myself, and that what's funny may be that the characters are pursuing things with a seriousness, but that they are unaware of what they're actually doing. I think there are some points in this where I realised, say, the character John, in that story, he's meditating, so it's only him. It's him in his own brain. It's him trying to be mindful before that became fashionable. And he is a narcissist. And I wanted to write a farce that took place in the brain, where there are things, lines in the story, images that come into his head, which are similar to characters going in and out of wardrobes and hiding under the bed and jumping out in a farce. So in a way, I knew, farces are meant to be funny. But I've read that a couple of times, and people don't laugh. I've read it to audiences, and people don't necessarily laugh at the same points. It's not a kind of boom boom.
No,
people will sort of
one or two
catch up with something, a few lines later, and suddenly think, "Oh my God, that's ridiculous." But I'm hearing back from you how you read the book. My image of it is probably different to yours.
Well, that ought to be the case,
Yeah.
Especially for a writer like you. You were taught, of course, by Malcolm Bradbury, and I've read somewhere that you're quite concerned with sort of the progress of literature and of batons being handed on from one to another. Yeah, you said somewhere that Ian McEwan, who's another of Malcolm Bradbury's alumni, got the 70s exactly right. Do you see literature in those terms?
I think that there are lots of lineages. There are lots of ones which are that there could be one for horror writing, say, or for writing funny short stories or something, and people do pass that on, and you could see a lineage between, I don't know, P.G. Wodehouse and Douglas Adams with intervening writers. I picked that out, I think, because there's such a clear lineage between Angus Wilson, Malcolm Bradbury, and then Ian McEwan, going from Angus Wilson's kind of dark stories early on that he wrote, through things like The History Man, to Ian McEwan's first stories, and the way they look on the page, the density of the prose, the rhythm of the prose. They have a real kind of solidity and sort of social grip, but also Angus Wilson famously getting the 50s, and being the one to encapsulate it. Malcolm Bradbury, the 70s, I think The History Man does a huge amount in nailing sociology, left-wing thought, and he's playing with it, the hypocrisy of some of it, but also the passion of it. And then Ian McEwan with this kind of grey late 70s, early 80s. And I'm not putting myself on the end of that, but I do, or maybe I am, but whether I succeed or not, I do think that one of my things is to try and get my times right. That's one of the things I want to try and do. And they're different times. There's also maybe with all of those writers a comic angle on things.
Oh, all of them, yes.
Yeah.
And
but
again,
say Angus Wilson is really unread now, and I think his novels feel in some ways unreadable almost. They're these huge kind of brick walls of prose that how do you get into them? They're so socially dense. They want to be Middlemarch. But
I have to admit, I find them a little daunting, a little intimidating.
Yeah, and I think that may be, you may be daunted, I'm daunted, but that may be our fault. We may just not be up to it. I think there are other writers, Saul Bellow or something, who I loved, who have a similar kind of density to them.
Yeah,
you fight your way through them.
Such a lightness of touch, though. Yeah. And his prose is so sublime that I think Bellow is like eating pudding. It's not the stodgy main course that you feel you ought to get through.
No, maybe Angus Wilson is Yorkshire pudding.
Almost certainly. Can we go back to Toby Litt then, and where you do sit in here, and I'm going to make another confession. I've always been impatient of those terribly experimental novels of the 60s, when people, putting the pages in at random, or they were doing things with typescript and typography to play with it, as though that was the whole point of writing.
Right.
Now, you have all these different devices. I want you to tell me, really. I want you to tell me that they arise out of the needs of the narrative. That you don't think, this would be a neat thing. I'll have a bit of a film script in here. That would be cool.
No, they don't work like that. But I have a feeling about the writers you're saying, the experimental writers of the 60s. Maybe the British ones didn't do it quite so well. B.S. Johnson didn't do it quite so well as some of the Americans. Donald Bartlemy, who I love, and I feel the same way as almost I do about, say, the Beats or the Pre-Raphaelites, which is that they had noble enterprises, that they were doing something really worthwhile, and the level of their achievement isn't necessarily to be judged as lacking just because they didn't write the greatest books ever out of that idea, because in some ways I feel they could have done. I really feel that I think On the Road is a great book, particularly the typescript version, and what Kerouac was after was something that was made just writing because you want to write about some kind of polite people having a bad time. He wants to really write out of his skin and make you feel alive and all those kind of things. And I think that the attempt to write as sort of intensely as you can, whatever it happens to be, alters the form in which you write. And with some of the ways the stories went, what I noticed was that they were almost collapsing as stories and turning into interviews or questionnaires. This happened in I play the drums in a band called OK, where some of the stories were questionnaires to the members of the band, and there was a feeling that as this book moves apart, as there are more characters, as the world gets wider, their forms get more diverse.
But then I think that all the forms, the playing with form, works if the writing is good enough. I always thought that of Kerouac and Burroughs and all of those Beats. The ones who were good would have been good whatever they decided to do. The form wasn't what made them. It's a bit like, method acting. A really good actor, if he decides to do it that way, will put in the performance.
Yeah.
So in Lifelike we have, there's one chapter which is just a set of medical notes.
Yeah.
There's a chapter which is just
it's
drawings.
actually a bill. It has large amounts of money. It's showing a very, very expensive cancer treatment in America. I mean the money is kind of the form there. So the to narrate an operation and recovery is just routine, but to kind of put the reader just briefly into the costing and to have them figure out through a list what's happened, that it felt it didn't need to be a story, because almost the main character Kavita in that story is not present for it. She's unconscious for some of it when she's being operated on. So in a way, she kind of dips out and then comes back afterwards. But what I'm trying to say is that the forms come out of emotional necessity, yes, but maybe I'm able to make it not so serious in the way you're saying, because I'm not as experimental, because these experimental writers went before. I'm trying to do things I think haven't been done, but I'm doing it 40 years or whatever after B.S. Johnson. He had a tougher time.
Okay.
Dear chap.
Yeah, but in the end, a book has to be readable, which this was. You think you say you can't see that it's necessarily a comedy. There's a chapter of tweets, and it's a Twitter account where one of the characters just tells her story beautifully, and she's without consciousness of what she's saying in a series of tweets. Well, it worked extremely well, because if you did narrate it as a sort of omniscient narrator, you would already know how foolish she was being about things. With
that one, what I felt very strongly about Twitter, and particularly I think it's become more of a form as time has gone on, is that sometimes it allows people to be fantastically articulate about something, even at the same time they're being fantastically inarticulate. And so I wanted her not to know that she was one of the world's great aphorists, that she was just kind of blurting observations that sort of backwards in sideways ways hit at truth. But and she doesn't know. She's very, very open with everything, and so there's no mediation. The one thing I'm not sure about that story, but I think it would have pushed your buttons to make it negative, is that if you read a Twitter feed, it would go in reverse.
That's true.
And so I made it chronological. In other words, to as if you had gone to her earliest post and then were reading up. But in the book, it's the other way around. Just I probably think that would have made it unbearable.
It would have been a bit 60s for my taste, if you'd done that.
Okay.
Can we talk a little bit as well about the... there seems to be, and you'll forgive me for this, a slightly middle-aged feeling to the book as well. All this adultery, all this agonising about sex, and John's obsession with penises. Oh, John is so obsessed with penises. I can imagine a man being obsessed with his own, but he's obsessed with other people's as well.
Yes.
And it all seemed to me very middle-aged. Is that just because Toby Litt's now a middle-aged man, or is it because you had something you wanted to explore and address?
Both. I think one of the models that I have as a writer is John Updike, and he's not my favourite writer, but in terms of how he continued, maybe it's inevitable that people tend to write about where they are in life, but I think to sort of seriously think about that stage and what it means, and to be honest about it, how much of midlife is spent thinking about penises, for example. I think that's part of what I think I'm doing. So obviously, if you're writing about childhood, as I wrote in Dead Kid Songs and other bits, you do that later. But I feel that there's a very interesting crossover between being middle-aged now, being in the middle of the sort of developed world in between Europe and in America, but at the same time wanting to be not just young, but wanting to be current, wanting to be alive by the measures that we have for aliveness, which is to be sexual, which is to be attractive, which is to be well hung, which is to be beautiful, all those things, and those pressures towards being, I don't know what the word is, fanciful, but being better,
viable.
Viable, still viable. Yeah. I think that's one of the things, but there's a melancholy to that, and there are things underneath. But and in some ways, I thought again, let's go straight for the heart of this. It will be about middle class people thinking about having affairs or not having affairs, or and I mean, one of the things that goes through it, John has unprotected sex with Agatha at a point where he may be HIV positive, and it was one of those things that maybe novels would pay off sort of harder. It would be more of a plotty thing, that things loom over you that you don't know about, that are in the background, and at least with the form of this, that I could have scenes play out where the reader knows that about Agatha, and they know that she may be HIV positive, possibly, and she's getting on really well with Paddy. There's a chance they'll go to bed, and the reader at that point, I hope, is very aware of a lifelike sensation, which is that we live in ignorance of lots of sharks beneath the surface, and that we don't understand other people and what they've done, where they've been. We think, well, not that we think we do, but we operate, I think, most of the time in a way that doesn't respect quite how in the dark we are.
Toby Litt, thank you very much. The book is Lifelike, and it's published by a publisher Seagull Press. I don't have a copy, so I don't know what the price is, but you've got one there.
The price is £19.50.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.